All right, good morning, everybody. It is 10 o'clock, and we will go ahead and get started just to be cognizant of everyone's time this morning. So welcome, my name is Jen Galt. I'm the Education Program Manager at ACI, and this morning we have a great presentation on a very relevant topic for the industry. Just a few housekeeping items before I introduce our two speakers this morning. If you could mute yourself if you're not already muted, that would be great, just to kind of eliminate any background noise that we might have as we move through the presentation. And then if you have questions, which I'm sure you will as we go through, feel free to drop them in the chat box for our presenters to answer at the end. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Todd Chapman from USI Insurance.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm Todd Chapman. I'm with I'm our P&C practice leader for USI locally, our Cincinnati and Dayton offices. I also head up our construction practice group. I think we've been ACI members for more than 20 years, Jen and Terry. So very proud to be affiliated with you all, and thank you for the opportunity to present this morning. A little bit about USI. We are a national insurance brokerage and consulting firm. We have approximately 200 local offices connected across the United States. We are responsible for risk strategy and insurance placement for over 4,000 contractors with premiums in excess of $1 billion annually. So we do a lot in the construction space locally and nationally. Locally, our construction practice group insures more than 300 contractors in the tri-state area. So we've had the pleasure of partnering with FMI on a regular basis for thought leadership and other consulting support. So we're very proud to be partnering with them this morning on the presentation. I'd like to take this opportunity just to introduce and properly introduce Jay Bowman. Jay is a principal with FMI. He has, over the past 20 years, he's helped them become the largest provider of management consulting and investment banking for the built environment. So as a managing director of research, Jay advises clients on a range of strategic decisions, including business diversification, market entry, and competitive positioning. He also co-authors FMI's annual US and Canada Markets Construction Overview, which is one of the most widely read in North America. Jay provides pro bono assistance to several industry groups, including the Associated General Contractors of America, the AEC Business Builders Forum. He's also served on many business and nonprofit boards, including his role as a member of the Alumni Board of Directors for the University of Georgia's Terry College of Business. Danette Beck, our national construction leader, reminds us of that constantly. She's a huge Georgia grad, so I know you two share that in common, Jay. But Jay earned his MBA from East Carolina and a BBA in risk management from the University of Georgia. He is proudly married with 3 daughters and enjoys spending time with the family, as well as wing shooting and naturally SEC football. So Jay, without further ado, thank you.
I appreciate that. Yeah, Danette and I actually graduated from Georgia together the same year, same program. So anytime we have a chance to promote Georgia, you don't have to twist our arm too hard. But it's an absolute pleasure to be here with everybody this morning and share a little bit of our outlook for the market going forward. We'll talk a little bit about just, how the overall economy is reacting to everything pandemic related, and how that actually translates into what we can sort of expect from a construction demand perspective, both I'll say near term, meaning the next 2 years, and then sort of the 2 years after that. So I think that's going to be an important thing to consider, because we're really talking about sort of these 2 different time spheres that we really have to be ready for. And then just talk a little bit too, just about, well, not only nationally, but locally, how does that create different opportunities? Where will those growth markets be? And then last, thinking just a little bit further, how could things related to the pandemic really start to, I'll say, reorganize the way we think about the delivery of AEC services. So I'm going to share my screen here. So let's pull this up. All right, Todd, if you can give me just the thumbs up that it's showing. Very good. All right, so it's working. Well, I will say that, when everything kind of started here early in the year with being stuck at home and everything else related to that, I have 3 teenage daughters, so it was a shock to them as well, not being around all their friends. You start to go maybe a little bit stir crazy if you're used to being out, and you start to find wisdom, maybe wisdom is a loose word here, in rather strange places. But I was really drawn to actually the song Tom Sawyer by Rush because of the line, changes aren't permanent, but change is. And so really that struck a chord with me, no pun intended, because I started to think through. At first it was like, oh gosh, how is this going to impact our marketplace? What are the things that, I'm going to have to do differently? We've never seen anything like this. And, having been in this industry for, several decades now, I was really starting to think through, well, gosh, I've been through several other big changes and disruptions to the marketplace. And, everyone on this call to some degree has had those same things. As the song says again, changes aren't permanent, but change is. That's the natural rhythm of the way things are. And so along those lines, one thing I just want to share with you as well as we think about this, and we think about, how do we prepare, for whatever the coming future is. There's obviously, good defense that has to be considered, but I think there's equally good offense. And so I'm reminded of, a gentleman by the name of Pierre Wack. He was a executive of Royal Dutch Shell back in the 1970s. And actually considered to be, one of the, I'll say, early contributors or primary contributors to the idea of scenario planning from a business perspective. And his kind of view was, it was exactly in times like this of great uncertainty that the greatest entrepreneurial opportunity or potential actually exists. So I think that's a good thing to consider, is that there really are opportunities, and we should keep that in mind as we think forward. So with that, sort of 3 big takeaways. What do I want to remember? And it's kind of like, on Sunday morning, the preacher's always got his 3-point sermon. I've got my 3-point presentation, so I hope I'll be in good company here. But a couple things to keep in mind. Number one, that the present reality of the COVID-19 pandemic and its sort of, I'll say, unintended consequences, right? So there's the near term and there's the long term. We'll definitely get into that near-term aspect of which markets are impacted the most, when can we expect a recovery, et cetera. But I also want you to be thinking about how has the pandemic, or how could the pandemic become a catalyst for the way in which competition in this industry evolves over time. Whether it was the stay-at-home orders, all the things related to doing things virtually. This is not some, I'll say, small thing, in my opinion. This has the potential to make some major changes to our industry. And as I mentioned, there's sort of these 2 aspects. There's obviously the near term and there's the long term. One thing to keep in mind about the near term, and if any of you heard me speak the last time I was, I believe, in Cincinnati with y'all, one of the things that we talked about was the fact that our construction industry typically lags the overall economy by about, a 1.5 to 2 years. So even if we were to experience some V-shaped recovery, just an immediate return to whatever, normal is, the truth of the matter is that we really won't feel it for quite a while, because we have to kind of work through, as you know, all the backlog and everything else, and what's sort of coming behind it. What's the work that would be, refilling, that backlog, if you will, and that really starts to hit hard in the next couple of years. So kind of being ready for that. But then also the concept that, bull markets and bear markets coexist at all times, meaning that, regardless of the economy, there are always pockets of growth. Things that are growing for whatever reason, the demand is there that is counter to what may be happening in the broader economy. And that's even the same when things are really good. And we can see growing markets, and there can be, things that aren't doing well. I mean, for the last several years, we had basically almost a 10-year recovery cycle, and yet water, wastewater construction never really took off during that time period. So again, this concept of bulls and bears coexisting. And then just like I was saying, the concept or the idea from Pierre Wack that use this opportunity as a chance to think about, well, what could we do differently? How could I truly think about positioning my company now so that in the future, I have some advantage. I'm in a better position than I am now. As one of the things a gentleman at Haskell Construction said one time, it's not a return to normal, it's a return to better. And when I think of what we have talked about with other contractors, particularly coming out of the Great Recession, and sort of deciding, well, what was the lessons learned? What were the things you would have done differently? And it's interesting that I'd say, 99% easily of the people that we talked to, and we asked them, well, what would you have done differently? Had you known there was going to be this almost 40% decline in construction spending across every kind of category, what would you have done differently? And most people said, really, well, in the end, we made the right strategic decisions. We just didn't make them soon enough. And so I really think we're at that point now where we've sort of gotten past the biggest part of the hit to the economy and to the markets and to everything else, that now is the time to really start thinking about what are the moves I'm going to start taking. So keep those three things in mind, and I really think it will serve you well as you think about how do we start preparing now, as a lot of people are moving into planning season for 2021 and beyond. So let's just start a little bit with the economy. If we use GDP as the measurement here to kind of say, where things have been, of course, the 33% decline in GDP in the second quarter is just, something that's almost impossible to get our heads around. And we're talking something in the neighborhood of 4 to 5 times, the second largest drop in a single quarter in GDP. So just absolutely unprecedented. But when you think about, we shut down the economy and we shut down jobs, and 2/3 of the population or the workforce rather has to be physically present to do their jobs, it's not really surprising that we would see such a decline. But there's some indications that, not only are most projections that third quarter GDP might be up close to 20%, there's even some suggesting it could be as high as 35% by the time the numbers come in. I think that's a little bit of a stretch, but when I look at some of the data, it's not necessarily outside of the realm of possibilities. And then you even start to look beyond. You look and say, okay, well, what about 2021? Well, you're sort of in what I call China numbers at that point, when you're talking somewhere around almost 7% GDP growth. So that is a good sign in a sense, even though what I said is that we lag, because it shortens that duration. And what is that? That total hit that we may take as an industry. So the better the economy does, this does not mean that it's a sudden turn for us, but it does limit sort of the downside risk for us. And so why would we then say, well, okay, why should I believe that, the economy is perhaps returning to some semblance of normality or improving? Well, when we look at some of the data, 10.5 million jobs have been added over the past 4 months, which is about half those that were lost. The Purchasing Managers Index, which is one of the better indicators of economic activity, registered at 56. That's an 18-month high. Home sales are up almost 25%, and with indication that the mortgage rates will continue to stay low. That's a good indication, again, of economic activity, because think about how residential construction really leads commercial and everything else. And then retail sales. Consumer activity makes up 2/3 of our economy, and that's up 4% over the prior peak. So there's plenty of indication that we are sort of in the right direction. I would not say that we're completely out of the woods, but I do think that there is strong indication that things truly are sort of turning the corner sooner rather than later. So every economic forecast is a point in time, is based on what we know today. So if you had asked me and you said, well, can you come sit in an organization and say, well, what should we be looking at on a regular basis? Because this presentation is over in just about 45 minutes. And then, what do we do after that? How do we take this information? What should we be doing on a regular basis? And so if I were sitting in your organization and counseling you on what would I be looking at, there's sort of 4 what I'll call underrated economic indicators that I think everyone should be watching to get a really good sense of really where are things headed in the future. Because a lot of indicators are backwards looking. And GDP, even though we just showed it to you, it is still a good indication of kind of where things have been and where they may be going. But the problem with GDP is it really is backward looking. It comes out once a quarter, which is way too infrequent when things are moving as fast as they are, and it's clearly subject to revision. So, but all of these overrated indicators, these, in a sense, are the ones that you'll see the most in the news and on television and everything else. So what would you look at instead? Well, because GDP is backward looking, one of my favorite indicators, and the reason it's at the top of the list, is the Chicago Fed National Activity Index. This indicator is very much forward-looking. It accounts for over 85 different economic indicators. One of my favorite things about it is not sentiment-based. And what I mean by that is just not subject to opinion, right? Because when I think of sentiment-based, I think of, at one time we all thought the world was flat and we thought that putting leeches on us was a great health benefit. And thank goodness that was the consensus, but thank goodness that's no longer the consensus. Consensus can change. And so it's just like with these economic indicators, it's just how people feel. And the Chicago Fed National Activity Index isn't. And because it's so strongly correlated to GDP, again, it's a very good projection. It comes out much more frequently. The last one just came out on the 21st of this week. So one that you should absolutely have in your arsenal. Not population, but employment statistics. Another key indicator, particularly this time around, because the loss of jobs is really what led us into this recession. The return of jobs is what will lead us out. And most, I'll say, employment figures are based on the current employment statistics or CES survey. What is sort of a challenge with this one is that it only counts those people on an official employer's payroll, right? And if we think about, how many jobs don't really show up on that? Think of, we're in a gig economy these days. So the person who, starts their own business out of their garage, or the Uber driver, or whoever it may be, it severely undercounts those people who are actually working and contributing to the economy. Furthermore, it kind of has a tendency to double count. So, for example, if I got a job at the grocery store during the day, a part-time job, and then I got a part-time job in the evening at a fast food restaurant, the CES would count that as 2 jobs that were created. But in fact, it's really kind of only 1 job that was created. It's only 1 person that's just working 2 part-time jobs. In the CPS, the current population survey doesn't do that. I think it just gives you a much better indicator of truly where we are from an employment perspective. And to keep in mind too that the jobless claims on a weekly basis really need to be probably as close to a million, and preferably around 500,000 before we really know if things have turned. The other 2 I kind of already touched on the prior slide. Retail sales versus consumer confidence. For all the reasons I really don't care for sentiment indexes, the retail sales is the opposite of that. It's just pure data. It comes out every month, and so it's another really good one to look at. And then the purchasing managers index is another one that I would absolutely say look at as well. It's very stable, which is one of the things I like about it. So it's predictable, and it's a leading indicator, meaning it gives us a sense of what is likely to happen going forward, not going backwards. So keep these four in mind. I just think that because of the frequency in which they come out, how well I think that they give an indication of what the economy is doing, these are good. Now, these don't cover everything. If you think about, locally, what you're doing, the type of work. If I'm in school construction, I want to know what's going on from an enrollments perspective. I want to know about bonds. If I'm in any other type of work, there's going to be other indicators I want to look at as well. But these will give you a good sense of just the overall health and direction of the economy, which I think is a good one. So with that being said, I mentioned there was a lag in our industry relative to the overall economy. So to put in this perspective, let's just take kind of a history lesson from the Great Recession. And so if we say that the official dates of the Great Recession were December of 2007 to June of 2009, so a year and a half, you also have to take into account that the government doesn't declare a recession until we've had 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP. And they won't report a recovery or the end of a recession until you've had 2 quarters of positive GDP. So if we take that into consideration, we would say in reality, not what the government reports, but how the economy actually worked, that the recession or the Great Recession actually ended by the end of 2008. That was really sort of end of 2008, beginning of 2009. And when we compare that to construction activity, and I've just taken construction spending, this is total construction spending in the US, so this is single family homes, healthcare, offices, power, roads, everything in between. And just trying to look at, well, how much spending was there on a monthly basis? And it's a little bit hard to get an exact monthly figure, but you can get kind of a range. We can see that even when, we take into account, when the economy really turned at end of 2008, that construction spending really had not, completely bottomed out. We were kind of growing a little bit still, again, some of that seasonal, but we really didn't hit the bottom or, really the lowest point in construction spending until February of 2011. So we're talking, a little more than 2 years in terms of the delay till we really felt the bump before we started to recover. You compare that to the overall economy. Retail sales exceeded their prior peak by July of 2009, and the PMI was in full recovery by September of 2009. So again, just because I think that there are reasons to be positive about the economy, and I think we have to be hopeful, there's also the reality of the current situation, which is we do need to be prepared. There's no way to avoid that 33% drop in GDP. It will have an impact, and we probably won't feel the full brunt of it until somewhere around 2022. Now, what could change that? Meaning, what could also shorten that duration? And I think one of the characteristics of this recession that will be more prominent than perhaps what we've seen in some other recessions is the geographic nature of this. This will be highly dependent from a recovery standpoint on when, whether it's 2 years for everybody or it's, 6 months for one and 3 years for another, is very dependent on what is going on from a geographic standpoint. Now, from a view of the virus itself, think about how different, different states and cities performed in terms of infection rates and everything else, community spread, et cetera. That's no different than what we would see this time around from a construction perspective. So in this map, I just wanted to kind of look at and say, okay, well, if I start to think about that from a geographic standpoint, what states might be at a higher risk of a longer recovery versus a shorter one? Now, one thing I want you to be clear about, this is not a prediction. This is not saying, for example, that Colorado, because it is red, means that it will recover later than everybody else or later than the US on average. All it's saying is that the risk of a longer recovery is higher. And we looked at such things as resiliency factors and risk factors related to states. So think about that as things like unfunded pension liabilities, as well as, what the rainy day fund might look like for that state, the impact of taxes. Because if you think about that, I mean, about for the average state, from the first and second quarters of the year, the average loss of tax revenue is around 50%. And to say, well, what does that mean? 50% loss. Well, if you play that forward to 2021, that's about a fifth of their budget that has to be removed. So when budgets are typically cut, whether it's a state or municipal government, one of the first things that goes is capital spending and construction. So this would start to help us understand, well, which ones of those states might not be in the best position. Unfortunately, with Ohio and sort of this sort of Northeast or Great Lakes region, there is a higher exposure to that risk. Again, it does not mean that it is going to recover later, but the risk is higher. So there's one thing to be cognizant of. Now, the question would be, well, what could change that? And really that becomes part of what's going from a stimulus perspective. So we're probably familiar with the CARES Act that came out, the $2.2 trillion, the extra $600 a week, and the unemployment benefits that was associated with that. So the question is, well, what comes behind that? So you have two plans. You have the Democrat plan, which is called the HEROES plan. You have the Republican plan called the HEALS plan. They both got to have some kind of, medical terminology to it, since it's all coronavirus related. But other than the main difference being the size of these stimulus packages, obviously the Democrat plan at $3.4 trillion, the Republican plan at $1.2 trillion. The thing that I would ask you to pay attention to is the difference in one of those areas, which is funding for state and local. You see that that's a large part of what's in the HEROES plan, and it is absent from the HEALS plan. So when there is some type of compromise, and I think that there will be, it will be a lower number in terms of the overall spending. It'll probably be closer to what was in the CARES Act or a little bit lower. So my guess is you'll see somewhere between 2 and 1.5 trillion. But the other big difference would most likely be in funding being made available to those state and local governments. And if that is true, if that is what happens, then that map on the prior slide could potentially change significantly, because then you would have more monies coming into some of those states, which would have the potential to shorten that duration in terms of the downturn and speed up the recovery. So again, one of those things to look for. And I probably should have said at the beginning that we will make copies of these slides available to anybody who wants them afterwards. So we'll make sure that you have that, because I won't touch on absolutely everything on every slide, but you will have it. So then the question is, well, what does this do to construction spending? And so I wanted to look specifically at the East North Central Census Division, and this is based on our latest Q3 forecast. We'll be actually shooting the video for that tomorrow. It should be released by Monday, I believe, next week. But this would be sort of an early preview, if you will, for what that third quarter forecast looks like. Now, if you talked about construction in totality, again, you combine non-residential buildings, residential buildings, and non-building structures for the U.S., we're actually seeing an improvement. Our Q2 forecast showed a total decline of about 20% from the peak in 2019 to the trough in 2022. Our new forecast has actually revised that to about a 15% decline. So now that 15% decline is great, but it's a heck of a lot better than 20. And it actually puts us somewhere in line with what we've seen in prior recessions, excluding the Great Recession, for the construction industry. Typical recessions in the past for construction have been somewhere between 10 and 15%. So it puts us a little bit on that, higher end, but it's more in line with sort of what we experienced. And when I started with FMI in the 90s, one of the first lessons I learned was, or people told me, was that the construction industry was a cyclical industry. And then the second thing I learned was that, well, everybody lied, because in the 90s, construction only did one thing. It only went up. But if you do go back and you look at, going back to the 50s, the 60s, 70s, 80s, there was a true cyclical nature to our industry. But when we look at the East, North, Central and say, okay, well, what is the impact here? What are we really looking at? You can see that in some cases, with the non-residential buildings at close to about $70 billion at the peak around 2019, that we really don't bottom out until right about 2022, right around about 60, higher 50s, low 60s in terms of $60 million. So somewhat of a significant decline that puts us in that 15 to 20% range on a non-residential side. But we don't see nearly sort of the same impact on residential and non-building structures. Now, non-building structures is what most people would think of in terms of kind of your heavy civil type of work, so roads, power, etc. And this is a fairly normal pattern that we see for non-building. You don't have the highs, but you don't have the lows. It's pretty much a steady performer. It's probably more fascinating that residential buildings in the East, North, Central, which includes basically think of Wisconsin down to Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, think of those types of areas, really has never recovered from the same levels that it was really back around 2002 at around $50 billion. But actually holding relatively steady. It was $29 billion in 2019. Looks to be roughly about the same by the time we get with a little bit of a dip in between. But the biggest impact that we will obviously feel will be in the non-residential buildings, what people think mostly as commercial, institutional, and industrial type construction. Now, as we start to think about the subcomponents of that and what is behind some of that lag, I started looking at some other sources, and this one from Oxford Economics and the McKinsey Global Institute I found pretty fascinating, and I wanted to share it with you. But what they did is they kind of looked at all these different industries and said, okay, well, what is the soonest that we could expect some type of recovery? And this would be in a virus-contained scenario, meaning that we would have a vaccine in place, that the rate of infections and positive cases would be minimal. That's sort of what the front edge of that bar means. The back end would be a more muted recovery. So, we may have a vaccine, but, people either don't take it, it doesn't prove to be effective. As more things open up, we have higher infection rates and more positive cases, et cetera. But it gives you a sense of kind of how wide or narrow that likely recovery is. Now, the way I like to think about it is it gives me some indication of, well, if construction typically follows the recovery in these industries, it starts to give me a sense of, well, when could that be? So again, if you think about construction lagging, say, by about a year to a year and a half, one way to think about it is look at healthcare and social assistance. And I only highlight these in orange. It doesn't really mean anything other than they're just ones I wanted to draw your attention to. Healthcare was one of the hardest hits during the pandemic, primarily because the allowances for elective surgeries were completely shuttered, and that's the most profitable aspect of a healthcare system. And when you can't do that, it just wiped away the capital programs for so many healthcare systems around the country. But under these sort of assumptions that Oxford Economics and McKinsey has, they said, well, the earliest it could recover would be in the basically second quarter of 2020. And then they're saying, well, the latest would be somewhere around the first quarter of 2021. I think then from a construction perspective, and this may be true, and we do see more elective surgeries starting to happen again. But if we really thought from a construction perspective, I would say that we probably wouldn't feel much until either late 2021 or even early 2022. So you'd have to almost think about, if I push that back a year to a year and a half, when would we really start to see those projects start to occur? So if any of these segments that you're involved in, or these different industries, you can start to overlay this and say, when would that happen? The worst up here, obviously, arts, entertainment, recreation, accommodation, and food services. even under the best case scenario, showing that it's really 2024 before we would see recovery in those. And we see so many hotels, particularly in some of the first tier cities, that are still running less than 20% occupancy. So many of those hotels, particularly the luxury brands, so your JW Marriott's, your Ritz-Carltons and those types, that are so dependent on business travel. They're talking about in some cities, that the number of restaurants that may never come back is perhaps, 2/3 to as high as 75%. So, I mean, this is in for a long recovery, where construction activity may not even pick up until after 2025. Transportation and warehousing, it has a very long one, but I'm more bullish on transportation and warehousing, particularly in the light of everything that's happened from an e-commerce perspective. Same thing on manufacturing, but remember, manufacturing covers a whole lot of different types, from pulp and paper to pharmaceuticals to automotive, etc. But I think it does give a good sense. I did highlight construction because I did include that one as well. But given that this is the only industry that we work in, and we have the benefit of a little bit more history, I do think that they're quite optimistic to think that our industry is in full recovery by the fourth quarter of 2020. Again, I would say we're probably around 2022 before we would see that. But again, everything depends on both geography and the type of work you're in. But again, I think a good way to start thinking about which industries are more, say, exposed than others. So then what would that look like on a construction perspective by segment? And here I drilled it down to Ohio specifically. So we're only looking at construction spending within the state of Ohio. The way you would just read this chart is on the x-axis or on the horizontal axis. That's just the estimated size of these different segments in terms of construction spending put in place for 2020. So single family being at the largest, at probably about $3.2 billion, let's say. Religious at the smallest at maybe around $100 million. On the x-axis, the y or vertical axis, you're looking at the projected growth over the next 5 years, 2020 through 2024. And one of the first things that you'll notice is how few are actually over 0% on a compound annual basis over the next 5 years. But I would also point out, just like I mentioned at the very beginning, that we have to consider this as in two different time frames, right? The next 2 years, which are a down cycle, if you will, and then the 2 years after that, 23 and 24, which would be the up cycle. So in some of these cases, whether it's healthcare, transportation, which represents things like airports, rail stations, things like that, highway and street, power, some of these, it is sort of that 0%. Don't be confused to think that that is a flat line across those 5 years. It's sort of that down and then back up. And then just like on the prior slide where I was showing that, the accommodations, and food service, and arts and entertainment, and all those look like they wouldn't recover until 2024. You can see some of these markets, just for Ohio, just look pretty abysmal for the next couple of years. Amusement and recreation over the next 5 years, down 10% compounded annually. Commercial down almost 12%, office down 10%. So kind of getting a sense of where are some of those major exposures in the marketplace. Now, another way to think about this chart, though, is that in these segments, there are different types of, I'll say, projects that would act different. So if we're looking at office, for example, currently data center construction is included in office. Ken Simonson with AGC, he and I have done a lot of things together. He's actually part of the committee working with the census to create a breakout segment for data centers to add to the census numbers, which would be good. Same thing with commercial. Commercial includes both traditional brick and mortar retail, but it also includes all the distribution centers and everything related to e-commerce. And then if you look at healthcare, well, it's hospitals, but it's also medical office buildings and sort of specialty care centers. So in all these cases, you really think about, before I start to look at a forecast like this and start making, decisions about my business, is really understanding what is that addressable component that represents, the true type of work that I pursue, whether it's the type of subsegment or even if it's just the volume or the dollar size. If I don't pursue projects over 500 million or I don't pursue projects less than 50 million, how would that impact the volume and type of construction activity I would expect, for my particular business. So let's talk about some of those bulls and bears over the next couple of years. Where is the true growth expected? And when I say growth, I'm talking about, not being surprised of double-digit increases in construction spending over the next couple of years. And there's really four big ones. There's sort of a fifth one, but I'm not really sure how big of an impact it would have, locally in Ohio. But the four big ones from a bull perspective would be pharmaceutical manufacturing, including biomedical and life sciences. We were big on this even before the pandemic. And that was much more to do with the evolution of small molecule therapies to biologics. You don't need to know anything other than biologics are just more an advanced type of pharmaceutical. The exclusivity period or patent period, if you want to call it that, is 12 years versus 5 years for small molecules. So there's a lot of money to be made in these. And so it's also one of those, not just where, there's this need because these new drugs are coming out, but unlike an office environment, these people have to be physically there to work in these labs and in these types of facilities. So there's a component to it as well that continues to drive construction activity. And it's not just the active pharmaceutical ingredient manufacturers like the Johnsons and Johnsons, the AstraZenecas and the Mercks of the world, but the developers, the REITs and others that are trying to pour a lot of activity and money into this space. But then it's kind of got the shot in the arm, if you will, with everything related to the pandemic, because think about how it just revealed our sort of reliance on foreign sources for some of the most just basic drugs. And so we've had, the government create different sources, whether it's the Biological Advanced Research Development Authority, commonly known as BARDA, which is currently funded over $1 billion to reshore pharmaceutical manufacturing to the U.S. The FDA also has funds to help with developing advanced manufacturing facilities in the biomedical and life sciences field. There's a lot of money and activity being poured to help this. You've probably seen what happened with Kodak, for example. That's a good example of some of that activity. So we'll continue to see a lot of activity. Again, it's not just at that high end, like that API manufacturing. It's in the capsule and the packaging as well. It's the whole chain, if you will, in that regard from a pharmaceutical manufacturing perspective. The second one being really in the distribution space. In the last 3 months, and I just continue to be shocked by this, but we had more growth in e-commerce in the last 3 months than we did in the prior 10 years combined. This is not a fad or a temporary change in consumer behavior. In my opinion, this marks really sort of a step change or a Z shift, if you heard it talked that way, and truly in which the way goods are bought in this country. You look at Walmart, adding Walmart Plus to compete with Amazon Prime. I mean, so much of the financial, performance of Walmart and Target and others, where they beat expectations, was because of their e-commerce business, not their traditional brick and mortar type of work. It also explains why companies like Target acquired the company Shipt in 2018, which at the time was the largest same-day grocery delivery service. And so we're seeing tons of activity on the DC side of things, particularly in the last mile facilities. But one of the more fascinating areas of growth is actually in cold storage. Because of same-day delivery, we've actually opened up the other half of consumer goods, which is perishable goods, groceries, things like that. So just a ton of activity that is going on in that regard. I really wouldn't be surprised if grocery stores as we know it, particularly the big ones, become somewhat of a thing of the past. The most basic ones will just be delivered. You know, no one really gets excited going and buying their box of Tide. Well, maybe some people, but I could just have it delivered and have no problem with that. You know, maybe some of the more, you know, higher end type grocery stores like the Whole Foods of the world will continue to attract people, but for the basic stuff, I'm not really sure. On data centers, of course, there's been, you know, tremendous growth there over the last several years and continues to be. But much of that growth in the past was around the hyperscale data centers. These are your, you know, 1 million square foot plus types of facilities. But now we're actually seeing a lot of growth in what they call the day two operations. So these are like the $30 to $50 million expansions. It's upgrading a class 1 to a class 2 or class 2 to a class 3. We'll just see tremendous activity there, not to mention the rollout of 5G and everything that that is going to represent. And then the last one really here is the intelligent transportation systems. We haven't raised the federal gas tax in almost 30 years. 1993 was the last. And during that time period, cars have become much more efficient. The number of electric vehicles is expanding at an exponential rate. And there's just frankly no way to, even if we raise the federal gas tax, to come up with the monies needed to not only expand the current system, but just to maintain it at an efficient level. And so we have to really look for new ways to fund, I'll say, you know, transportation. So electronic tolling is one of the fastest growing, even in areas where tolling typically wasn't even really considered an option. Now it is. And also when we start to think about, you know, charging stations, we're hearing chatter of utilities, you know, looking to partner with the DOTs to basically fund the rollout of, you know, new electric charging stations to replace gas stations in some regards. It gives the utility, you know, another opportunity to sell electrons, and it gives the DOT another way to, you know, collect taxes. And so between those two, much more of the funding continues to be driven locally, and what the state and the, you know, say the local municipal and county governments will do in that regard. The fifth one that I didn't have up here because I'm not really sure how big an impact it will have on Ohio yet is really in the wind power segment. It is actually the largest provider of electricity in Iowa and Kansas already. And so we are seeing major shifts to wind energy. It will probably double in terms of generating capacity over the next, I'll say, you know, 10 years. At the same time, coal is going from 50% of our power that we produced in 2008 to 19% or 20% last year, and by some projections, 5% by the end of the decade. So we're seeing a major change in just the power side of things. Touched a little bit already on some of the bear markets, obviously the lodging, the commercial, amusement, and recreation, anything that requires large crowds. And even when things are under control, there's this idea of this fear of going out. And really what, you know, will people feel comfortable doing and going out and doing? And same thing with offices. You know, I think that offices is really sort of a two-part story. You know, in the urban core and some of the major markets, we may not see as much. In places like New York even, occupancy is below 10% in some cases. But what we may see is with the move to the suburban, the large scale office construction may be down, but we might actually start to see smaller sort of, you know, low rise or mid-rise type of office in more suburban settings. My personal belief is that sometime by the end of 2021, the change in the workforce would look something like this. You know, 25% of people never returning to an office, you know, working completely virtual or remote, you know, on a permanent basis. Another 25% maybe coming into the office 1, maybe 2 days a week, and then about 50% actually coming in on a normal basis. So if that pattern plays out, that's a major change in what may be required from just an infrastructure perspective. Real quickly, just, how does this look across the markets? Each one of these are just the different metropolitan statistical areas or MSAs in the country. There's a little over 300. Size of the bubble just represents the total volume of construction spending, so you get a sense of size, and the color is just the projected growth or decline. Dark blue is growing markets, orange are declining markets, but it gives you a sense of what things may look like, what you could expect in terms of growth. And then just a little last thing I would just touch on here, going that kind of next steps in terms of, well, how would I really begin to think about, beyond just the demand equation here, how could really the pandemic and everything related to it truly, I'll say, reinvent the way in which we think about competition? And one of my favorite quotes is by Mark Twain. It says, "It's not what you don't know that usually gets you in trouble. It's what you know for certain that just ain't so." And I think in our industry, sometimes, and I include myself in it, I'm as much part of this industry as everybody else. We tend to think that, well, that may happen over there, but construction's different. You just can't. That doesn't happen in construction. Well, do we start to fall in that trap of, we know for certain that it will never happen in construction, and lo and behold, it does. So think about some of the things that we could potentially see, and how would this change competition? So if social distancing starts to give way to community distancing, meaning that the urban core of the really large cities doesn't have the same attractiveness as sort of the suburban markets. Again, just like I was saying with office, if that's different, who can compete on, say, a 50, or not even 50, let's just say like a 30-story building versus a 3-story building? That changes the competitive dynamic, right? What about just the democratization of technology? Meaning that, with more and more people having to work at home, with just the I'll say acceleration of the use of technology, we've already seen sort of the blurring of the line or the distinction between engineering and construction. But what other, whether it's the use of drone technologies, or any other type of, I'll say, technology that creates sort of a, broad-based, anybody can do that skill set. I mean, I even think like in some of the prefabrication side of things, where people are able to take someone off the street that, doesn't know how to bend pipe, but they put them in a controlled environment, and within a couple of weeks, their bending pipe is great as somebody who's been doing it for years in the field. So when I said that democratization of technology, are there certain skill sets that start to not really stand out anymore? And how does that impact value migration? What really becomes the valuable thing that I'm selling to the client? I do think the other thing is dual purposing. As we've seen the drop in the number of people in buildings and other things, I think people are going to expect more from buildings. They're going to have to find a way in which the parts or the sum is worth more than the parts, whether it means it's producing its own power or whatever it may be. And then last, just, what about business development, procurement in an age of e-commerce, where, we haven't been able to go, see people, you're not taking anybody to baseball games, we're not going out for lunch in many cases. How does that really change the way in which we interact with people? And I would say it's even just beyond procurement. It's what about with hiring people? How do we onboard people? How do we get them to stay, become part of the culture when sometimes they're relatively absent? So start thinking about, these are just some of the early questions, but really challenge yourself to think about, well, what are some of the ways in which everything that's occurred really could change the way in which we do business? And where will that value migration occur? And what do I need to be thinking about now in order to start to operationalize in a way to get there? So that's sort of just the last thing I wanted to touch on. Again, going back to Kerouac, this is a time of great entrepreneurial potential. Don't be scared of this time. Look at it as an opportunity. Be smart. Again, we have the issue of what we're staring at down the barrel right now over the next 2 years. But there's still potential in many different ways. I appreciate the time. Everything I've talked about here in many cases have drawn from so many other things that we've produced and published. All of this is for free on our website at www.fminet.com. Again, we'll make a copy of the presentation available to everybody. And of course, I know Todd or myself are more than happy to answer any questions you may have if you want to get in touch with either one of us. But again, really appreciate the time. And Todd, I'll turn it back over to you to close us out.
Jay, thank you very much. You all at FMI just do such a great job taking some pretty complex, thoughts and making and delivering them in a way that really helps us understand and think through, the challenges before us. But I do want to land just lastly. There were some positive messages certainly all throughout your presentation, but some things that I took away certainly, we've added 10.5 million jobs in the last 4 months. That's a very positive thing. And, you mentioned the purchasing managers index, it's at an 18-month high, and, home sales are still up nearly 25%. Retail sales certainly up 4%. So, I think the reality as a group and as a construction industry, we need to, find those positives. We need to, be collaborative in the way that we approach, as you mentioned, those bullish and bearish markets and kind of our strategy moving forward. And really appreciate you putting this presentation together for this group and, taking the time to walk us through it.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Have a great day.
All right. Take care.
Thank you, Jen.
Thank you.